Civilizations of the 15th Century, Comparing China and Europe. Beyond the foraging, farming, and pastoral societies of the 15th century world were its civilizations, those city-centered and state-based societies that were far larger and more densely populated, more powerful and innovative, and much more unequal in terms of class and gender than other forms of human community. Since the first civilizations had emerged between 3500 and 1000 BCE, both the geographic space they encompassed and the number of people they embraced had grown substantially. By the 15th century, a considerable majority of the world's population lived within one or another of these civilizations, although most of these people no doubt identified more with local communities than with a larger civilization. What might an imaginary global traveler notice about the world's major civilizations in the 15th century? Ming Dynasty China. Such a traveler might well begin his or her journey in China, heir to a long tradition of effective governance, Confucian and Taoist philosophy, a major Buddhist presence, sophisticated artistic achievements, and a highly productive economy. That civilization, however, had been greatly disrupted by a century of Mongol rule, and its population had been sharply reduced by the plague. During the Ming Dynasty, however, China recovered. The early decades of that dynasty witnessed an effort to eliminate all signs of foreign rule, discouraging the use of Mongol names and dress, while promoting Confucian learning and orthodox gender roles, based on earlier models from the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties. Emperor Yangle sponsored an enormous encyclopedia of some 11,000 volumes. With contributions from more than 2,000 scholars, this work sought to summarize or compile all previous writing on history, geography, philosophy, ethics, government, and more. Yangle also relocated the capital to Beijing, ordered the building of a magnificent imperial residence known as the Forbidden City, and constructed the Temple of Heaven, where subsequent rulers performed Confucian-based rituals to ensure the well-being of Chinese society. Two empresses wrote instructions for female behavior, emphasizing traditional expectations after the disruptions of the previous century. Culturally speaking, China was looking to its past. Politically, the Ming Dynasty re-established the civil service examination system that had been neglected under Mongol rule, and went on to create a highly centralized government. Power was concentrated in the hands of the emperor himself, while a cadre of eunuchs, or castrated men, personally loyal to the emperor, exercised great authority, much to the dismay of the official bureaucrats. The state acted vigorously to repair the damage of the Mongol years by restoring millions of acres to cultivation, rebuilding canals, reservoirs, and irrigation works, and planting, according to some estimates, 1 billion trees in an effort to reforest China. As a result, the economy rebounded, both international and domestic trade flourished, and the population grew. During the 15th century, China had recovered and was perhaps the best governed and most prosperous of the world's major civilizations. China also undertook the largest and most impressive maritime expeditions the world had ever seen. Since the 11th century, Chinese sailors and traders had been a major presence in the South China Sea and in Southeast Asia port cities, with much of this activity in private hands. But now, after decades of preparation, an enormous fleet, commissioned by Emperor Yangle himself, was launched in 1405, followed over the next 28 years by 6 more such expeditions. On board more than 300 ships of the first voyage was a crew of some 27,000, including 180 physicians, hundreds of government officials, 5 astrologers, 7 high-ranking or grand eunuchs, carpenters, tailors, accountants, merchants, translators, cooks, and thousands of soldiers and sailors. Visiting many ports in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, these fleets, captained by the Muslim eunuch Zheng He, sought to enroll distant peoples and states in the Chinese tribute system. Dozens of rulers accompanied the fleets back to China, where they presented tribute, performed the required rituals of submission, and received in return abundant gifts, titles, and trading opportunities. Chinese officials were amused by some of the exotic products to be found abroad: ostriches, zebras, and giraffes, for example. Officially described as bringing order to the world, Zheng He's expeditions served to establish Chinese power and prestige in the Indian Ocean and to exert Chinese control over foreign trade in the region. The Chinese, however, did not seek to conquer new territories. establish Chinese settlements or spread their culture, though they did intervene in a number of local disputes. The most surprising feature of these voyages was how abruptly and deliberately they were ended. After 1433, Chinese authorities simply stopped such expeditions and allowed this enormous and expensive fleet to deteriorate in port. In less than 100 years, wrote a recent historian of the voyages, the greatest navy the world had ever known had ordered itself into extinction. Part of the reason involved the death of the Emperor Yongle, who had been the chief patron of the enterprise. Many high-ranking officials had long seen the expeditions as a waste of resources because China, they believed, was the self-sufficient Middle Kingdom, requiring little from the outside world. In their eyes, the real danger to China came from the north, where barbarians constantly threatened. Finally, they viewed the voyages as the project of the court eunuchs, whom these officials despised. Even as these voices of Chinese officialdom prevailed, private Chinese merchants and craftsmen continued to settle and trade in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, but they did so without the support of their government. The Chinese state quite deliberately turned its back on what was surely within its reach, a large-scale maritime empire in the Indian Ocean basin. European comparisons, state building and cultural renewal. At the other end of the Eurasian continent, similar processes of demographic recovery, political consolidation, cultural flowering, and overseas expansion were underway. Western Europe, having escaped Mongol conquest but devastated by the plague, began to regrow its population during the second half of the 15th century. As in China, the infrastructure of civilization proved a durable foundation for demographic and economic revival. Politically, too, Europe joined China in continuing earlier patterns of state building. In China, however, this meant a unitary and centralized government that encompassed almost the whole of its civilization, while in Europe, a decidedly fragmented system of many separate, independent, and highly competitive states made for a sharply divided Western civilization. Many of these states, Spain, Portugal, France, England, the city-states of Italy, such as Milan, Venice, and Florence, various German principalities, learned to tax their citizens more efficiently, to create more effective administrative structures, and to raise standing armies. A small Russian state centered on the city of Moscow also emerged in the 15th century as Mongol rule faded away. Much of this state building was driven by the needs of war, a frequent occurrence in such a fragmented and competitive political environment. England and France, for example, fought intermittently for more than a century in the Hundred Years' War over rival claims to territory in France. Nothing remotely similar disturbed the internal life of Ming Dynasty China. A renewed cultural blossoming, known in European history as the Renaissance, likewise paralleled the revival of all things Confucian in Ming Dynasty China. In Europe, however, that blossoming celebrated and reclaimed a classical Greco-Roman tradition that earlier had been lost or obscured. Beginning in the vibrant commercial cities of Italy between roughly 1350 and 1500, the Renaissance reflected the belief of the wealthy male elite that they were living in a wholly new era, far removed from the confined religious world of feudal Europe. Educated citizens of these cities sought inspiration in the art and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. They were returning to the sources, as they put it. Their purpose was not so much to reconcile these works with the ideas of Christianity, as the 12th and 13th century university scholars had done, but to use them as a cultural standard to imitate and then to surpass. The elite patronized great Renaissance artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, whose paintings and sculptures were far more naturalistic, particularly in portraying the human body, than those of their medieval counterparts. Some of these artists looked to the Islamic world for standards of excellence, sophistication, and abundance. Although religious themes remained prominent, Renaissance artists now included portraits and busts of well-known contemporary figures, scenes from ancient mythology, and depictions of Islamic splendor. In the work of scholars known as humanists, reflections on secular topics such as grammar, history, politics, poetry, rhetoric, and ethics complemented more religious matters. For example, Niccolò Machiavelli's famous work, The Prince, was a prescription for political success based on the way politics actually operated in a highly competitive Italy of rival city-states, rather than on idealistic and religiously based principles. To the question of whether a prince should be feared or loved, Machiavelli replied, "One ought to be both feared and loved, but as it is difficult for the two to go together, it is much safer to be feared than loved. For it may be said of men in general that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, anxious to avoid danger, and covetous of gain. Fear is maintained by dread punishment which never fails. In the actions of men, and especially of princes, from which there is no appeal, the end justifies the means." While the great majority of Renaissance writers and artists were men, among the remarkable exceptions to that rule was Christine de Pisa, the daughter of a Venetian official who lived mostly in Paris. Her writings published against the misogyny of so many European thinkers of the time. In her City of Ladies, she mobilized numerous women from history, Christian and pagan alike, to demonstrate that women too could be active members of society and deserved an education equal to that of men. Aiding in the construction of this allegorical city is Lady Reason, who offers to assist Christine in dispelling her poor opinion of her own sex. "No matter which way I looked at it," she wrote, "I could find no evidence from my own experience to bear out such a negative view of female nature and habits. Even so, I could scarcely find a moral work by any author which didn't devote some chapter or paragraph to attacking the female sex." Heavily influenced by classical models, Renaissance figures were more interested in capturing the unique qualities of particular individuals and in describing the world as it was then, in portraying or exploring eternal religious truths. In its focus on the affairs of this world, Renaissance culture reflected the urban bustle and commercial preoccupations of Italian cities. Its secular elements challenged the otherworldliness of Christian culture, and its individualism signaled the dawning of a more capitalist economy of private entrepreneurs. A new Europe was in the making, one more different from its own recent past than Ming Dynasty China was from its pre-Mongol glory. European comparisons. Maritime voyaging. The global traveler during the 15th century might be surprised to find that Europeans, like the Chinese, were also launching outward-bound maritime expeditions. Initiated in 1415 by the small country of Portugal, those voyages sailed ever further down the west coast of Africa, supported by the state and blessed by the Pope. As the century ended, 2 expeditions marked major breakthroughs, although few suspected it at the time. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, funded by Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, made his way west across the Atlantic, hoping to arrive in the East, and in one of history's most consequential mistakes, ran into the Americas. 5 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama launched a voyage that took him around the tip of South Africa, along the East African coast, and with the help of a Muslim pilot, across the Indian Ocean to Calicut in southern India. The differences between the Chinese and European ocean-going ventures were striking, most notably perhaps in terms of size. Columbus captained 3 ships and a crew of about 90, while da Gama had 4 ships manned by perhaps 170 sailors. These were minuscule fleets compared to Zheng He's hundreds of ships and a crew in the many thousands. All the ships of Columbus and da Gama combined, according to a recent account, could have been stored on a single deck of a single vessel in the fleet that set sail under Zheng He. Motivation as well as size differentiated the 2 ventures. Europeans were seeking the wealth of Africa and Asia, gold, spices, silk, and more. They were also in search of Christian converts and of possible Christian allies with whom to continue their long crusading struggle against the threatening Muslim powers. China, by contrast, faced no equivalent power, needed no military allies in the Indian Ocean basin, and required little that these regions produced. Nor did China possess an impulse to convert foreigners to its culture or religion, as the Europeans surely did. Furthermore, the confident and overwhelmingly powerful Chinese fleet sought neither conquests nor colonies, while the Europeans soon tried to monopolize by force the commerce of the Indian Ocean and violently carved out huge empires in the Americas. The most striking difference in these 2 cases lay in the sharp contrast between China's decisive ending of its voyages and the continuing, indeed escalating, European efforts, which soon brought the world's oceans and growing numbers of the world's peoples under its control. This is why Zheng He's voyages were so long neglected in China's historical memory. They led nowhere, whereas the initial European expeditions, so much smaller and less promising, were but the first steps on a journey to world power. But why did the Europeans continue a process that the Chinese had deliberately abandoned? In the first place, Europe had no unified political authority with the power to order an end to its maritime outreach. Its system of competing states, so unlike China's single unified empire, ensured that once begun, rivalry alone would drive the Europeans to the ends of the earth. Beyond this, much of Europe's elite had an interest in overseas expansion. Its budding merchant communities saw opportunity for profit. Its competing monarchs eyed the revenue from taxing overseas trade or from seizing overseas resources. The church foresaw the possibility of widespread conversion. Impoverished nobles might imagine fame and fortune abroad. In China, by contrast, the support for Zheng He's voyages was very shallow in official circles, and when the Emperor Yongle passed from the scene, those opposed to the voyages prevailed within the politics of the court. Finally, the Chinese were very much aware of their own antiquity, believed strongly in the absolute superiority of their culture, and felt with good reason that, should they desire something from abroad, others would bring it to them. Europeans too believed themselves unique, particularly in religious terms, as the possessors of Christianity, the one true religion. In material terms, though, they were seeking out the greater riches of the East, and they were highly conscious that Muslim powers blocked easy access to these treasures and posed a military and religious threat to Europe itself. All of these propelled continuing European expansion in the centuries that followed. The Chinese withdrawal from the Indian Ocean actually facilitated the European entry. It cleared the way for the Portuguese to penetrate the region, where they faced only the eventual naval power of the Ottomans. Had Vasco da Gama encountered Zheng He's massive fleet as his 4 small ships sailed into Asian waters in 1498, world history may well have taken quite a different turn. As it was, however, China's abandonment of oceanic voyaging and Europe's embrace of the seas marked different responses to a common problem that both civilizations shared: growing populations and land shortage. In the centuries that followed, China's rice-based agriculture was able to expand production internally by more intensive use of the land, while the country's territorial expansion was inward towards Central Asia. By contrast, Europe's agriculture, based on wheat and livestock, expanded primarily by acquiring new lands in overseas possessions, which were gained as a consequence of a commitment to oceanic expansion.